can't believe there are people here. Don't you know it's Friday? I can't believe this. You're at an economics lecture. What's wrong with you people? Unbelievable. Well, thanks to Scott Horton, who is an absolutely great guy, by the way. He's interviewed anybody who's anybody. And anytime you feel like you've just been scammed by the news, and you want to know what's really going on, or what does this press release really mean, and what's really happening, you can go over to antiwar.com/radio, and I bet you that day Scott Horton interviewed somebody who told you the truth. I'm telling you, I mean, my iPod is filled with Scott Horton interviews. This guy interviews like you wouldn't believe. He does not let anybody get away with anything, even his own friends, like even me. In fact, people actually, he's so tough on his guests that there have been times, Scott, when people have emailed me and said, boy, that Scott Horton's a jerk, man. We got to go after him. No, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. But he doesn't want to just invite people on and throw softballs at them. You know, he doesn't want to do the Katie Couric style interview. He wants to have an actual interview where real things get discussed. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the economy a little bit, and I'm going to make this as interesting as I can. But to me, I never understood people who thought economics was uninteresting. Or as Lou Rockwell would say, that the Federal Reserve System was uninteresting. I kind of feel like the fact that we're all getting screwed is very interesting, actually. I find that quite interesting. I'm quite intrigued by this. So this is what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. Now, without getting into too much detail, you could perhaps go on the internet rumor mill for more details, but a couple weeks ago I had a really, really terrifying health scare that seems to have been just a fluke, but nevertheless, I've never had anything quite like this happen to me before, and this is the first time I've done any public speaking since that happened. So I'm certainly not going to read to you. I absolutely swear that I'm going to quit my career in public speaking if I ever come up and start reading off a piece of paper. However, I do have a bit of an outline just as a security blanket so that I can come up here and feel totally confident that if suddenly I just forget everything I'm talking about, I can just say, oh yeah, look, this is beautiful. I just wrote the thing down 3 seconds ago. It's a beauty. So anyway, now people are all panicked. What, did he have a stroke? Whatever. No, I'll tell you about this later. We'll all go out for drinks afterward and we can all talk about this. Although, wait a minute, some of you are too young for that. Right? Yeah. Well, we're all libertarians. We'll look the other way. I don't think I'm allowed to say that on university property, though. So don't tell them. Don't tell them I said that. All right, so the only slightly technical stuff that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, we're just going to get it right out of the way right at the beginning. And let me point out, by the way, that whoever set the temperature in this room was apparently pretty chilly today. But that's another matter of time. Let's get the technical stuff out of the way right at the beginning. Scott Horton mentioned something called the Austrian School of Economics, and I know a lot of people in this room know what that is. That doesn't mean I'm not going to tell you about it. I still am. I know a lot of you folks know what it is. Not as many Americans know what it is as need to, however. The Austrian School of Economics has nothing whatsoever to do with the country of Austria, other than the fact that some of the better-known theorists of the Austrian school came from Austria. But it has nothing whatsoever, there's no building you can go to in Vienna called the Austrian School of Economics. This is something that people who are reasonably well-informed would know. Like, for example, there's a Chicago School of Economics, but again, it's associated with the University of Chicago, but it's a school of thought. It's not a brick-and-mortar place, but likewise for the Austrian school. The Austrian school is the oldest continuously existing school of economic thought in the world. It is right now the smallest such school, but it is also the fastest growing, because it seems to have in it, and I say this with all due respect for all the decent non-Austrian economists there are, and there are some decent ones, it has the fewest stooges in it. That is to say, this is the school of thought that is most interested in telling the truth and least interested in bootlicking. These are not economists who are interested in telling the regime what it wants to hear. They're interested in telling the truth regardless of what that means for their own careers. They're going to be teaching in some podunk school somewhere. Doesn't matter, because at least they can sleep at night. And these are the people I want to talk to you about tonight. Now, as I say, they're not as well known as they should be. And one example of that I'll give you is, several weeks ago, I was speaking in a kind of a debate at the University of Connecticut School of Business. I had a long drive just now in the car with no water. And I was up against the CEO of one of the largest insurance companies in the world. And so he knows he's going up against a guy from the Austrian school, and then he sat through a 40-minute presentation on the Austrian school. And then when it came time for us to ask questions of each other, he said, "Now, Tom, this is going to sound like a zinger, and I don't mean this to be a personal attack or anything." And I stood there thinking, wow, maybe this guy really has the definitive reply to the Austrian School of Economics. All right, go ahead, do your worst. And his reply was, "You know, you have any idea what the GDP of Austria is?" I mean, it's really low. I mean, it's like the Netherlands or something. It's really low. So whatever may have worked for Austria, and I thought, I don't believe, and I'm sort of trying to stage whisper to the guy, no, it has nothing to do with the country. No. But he's just going on, yammering on, making it worse and worse and worse. And so I had to, I had to defend myself because half the room probably thinks I'd been zinged. And I had to say, well, this is like saying we shouldn't listen to Milton Friedman because the GDP of Chicago is pretty low. It's a bizarre thing, so people need to know about this. F.A. Hayek, who was an economist of the Austrian school, actually won the Nobel Prize in 1974. And sure, we've had a lot of bozos win the Nobel Prize in economics, so you may say, why does that matter? But Hayek wins the prize for telling the Nobel Committee something it does not want to hear. And what that was, I'll get to in a few minutes. So it is quite significant that he wins it. Now, Scott mentioned that I'm a senior fellow at something called the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and we've got some brochures about that. Take one, please. The Mises Institute is named after Ludwig von Mises, who died in 1973, born in 1881. Mises was arguably the greatest economist of all time. Certainly some of us believe that. Mises had quite an interesting life in that, of course, he lived in Austria for some time, lived in Europe for a long time, taught in Switzerland for a while, and then as the 30s progressed, he found that Europe was not quite so congenial a place for him any longer. Partly because, of course, he was Jewish, and partly because what he was teaching was not exactly what the National Socialist Party wanted to hear. Mises is teaching about the international division of labor and international cooperation through the free market. Well, that's really not exactly Hitler's program. Hitler's more into the autarkic empire kind of program. So this isn't what they want to hear. So they confiscate his books and papers, and Mises ultimately has to flee Europe with his wife, arrives in the United States in 1940, basically empty-handed and not speaking a word of English in his late 50s. So you'd think, well, that's it for this guy, right? It's all over for him. He gets to the U.S., has difficulty finding a paid university position. So here he is, an unbelievable genius. He has to take an unpaid position at New York University, where he stays as a visiting professor for over 20 years. So he had quite a visit. How did he get his salary paid? A group of businessmen who had the intellect and who understood the significance of what Mises was doing, they paid his salary. They supported him. And so Mises was viewed as this quaint 19th century Neanderthal type, very, very much out of the spirit of the times, which is very much in favor of central planning of the economy and third way between the extremes of socialism and capitalism. And this guy, holds his funny little seminars about the free market. Well, long after people who were passed over, for whom Mises was passed over, to get all these fancy university positions have been long forgotten. Mises has an institute named after him. Mises has a whole new generation of students learning and profiting from his work. And so Mises, in effect, has had the last laugh. And so we want to talk a bit about this extraordinary man who had every reason in the world to give up and to give in and just go along with the times, and he refused to do it. He absolutely refused to do it, in spite of what it meant for his career. So what I want to tell you about, first of all, so as I say, this is the one technical thing, is the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Now, I know some of you know this, but every time I talk about it, I get better at it. So I've got like a new twist every time. So now this is like Austrian business cycle theory, Tom Woods version 7.312. So maybe you'll hear there's some new wrinkle in it that you can use to help explain it. But this is the thing that F.A. Hayek wins the Nobel Prize for. It's a theory of the business cycle, why the economy moves in a cyclical pattern, up and down, up and down. Now, we sort of take for granted, because it's what we're always told, that's just the way the free market is, right? You know, it just goes up and down. It's just a psychological thing. Investors, you know, they get really optimistic, and then we go up, and then they get pessimistic, and we're down, and, you know, what can you do about that? Well, this is really a kind of an unsatisfying explanation, right? This sort of psychological thing. And if you look at the typical economics textbook today, you know, 900-page principles text, and you look for the discussion of the business cycle, where do you find it? Well, scattered throughout the text, you'll find like 9 references throughout the 900 pages, but there won't be a chapter on the business cycle. In terms of advances in understanding of the business cycle, it's been, I wouldn't say it's been a big zero, because there is a so-called real business cycle theory and this and that, but it's not too impressive, given all the research money that goes into some of these departments. But what the Austrians teach seems to make sense. It corresponds to reality. It corresponds to empirical examples. And so what the Austrian business cycle theory is trying to explain is, as I say, why the economy moves cyclically, especially given the fact that in the free market, we should be correcting for this. In other words, the free market rewards entrepreneurs who are good at what they do, who are good at forecasting what consumers want, and it penalizes people who stink at this. If you stink at forecasting consumer demand, then you're going to make losses, and you might even go out of business altogether. If you're really good at it, you make profits, you get to expand, you get to gain control over still further resources. This is the free market's way of saying, good job. We trust you now with more resources. So given that the market selects for people who are good at this, why would people who are good at this all of a sudden stink at it at the same time? Seems like it demands explanation. The British economist Lionel Robbins, in his book The Great Depression in 1934, asked this question: why is there a sudden cluster of error by entrepreneurs? Now, in order to answer this question, I need to introduce 2 points. And if you can get these 2 points, again, you will have a better grasp of this than 99% of the population. And that's not because I'm some genius, it's because Mises and Hayek were geniuses, and I'm a good tape recorder who can press play. Now first, the first concept involves stages of production. Now don't leave yet. Now I'm telling you, this gets good. Just hang on. The first thing involves what we call stages of production. That is to say, I'm sorry I'm so thirsty, but my gosh, this drive just went on and on and on and on. All right, anyway. So we have the productive structure. Like we got consumer goods that you and I buy, and then we have, as we move upward in what we call the structure of production, we move farther and farther away from consumer goods. So let's say raw materials, new mining capacity, research and development. Like I don't immediately consume research and development services, right? I mean, I might consume a massage, that type of service, but I don't consume research and development. Research and development isn't going to bear fruit for me for 10 years, maybe 20 years. So research and development would be considered a high-order stage of production because it's so temporally, that is to say in time, remote from a finished consumer good. So research and development, mining, raw materials, manufacturing, construction, a lot of these things, they're time-consuming. It takes a while before they're actually going to bear fruit in the form of a product that you and I buy. So the difference between a low-order stage of production and a high-order stage is the difference between the bagel I buy in a bakery and wheat growing in a field. So one of those things I consume immediately, and the other one is temporally very remote from consumption. So we have a structure of production, and we go from high to low. So when we get down to wholesaling, now we're starting to get closer to a finished consumer good that I might buy. Marketing services to communicate to me that the good exists is getting closer and closer. Retail stores, now we're practically there. And transporting it to the retail stores and so on. So that's how the Austrians think of production. Okay, we think of capital as existing in a series of stages. And this is one of the ways that, one of the things that distinguishes the Austrians from mainstream economics. Mainstream economics thinks of capital as being a big homogeneous blob, where they use the capital letter K to refer to it. So they just want to know, was there more capital or less capital? Well, we're sort of arguing that that's not really a very good question. It's what types of capital are there? And do they interlock with each other? Do they work together? Do they function together? This is what we want to know. We want to disaggregate capital and look at it in its various stages. The second point I need to introduce, and then we'll see this all come together, involves interest rates. Now here we introduce the common sense point that businesses tend to engage in their long-term investment projects when interest rates are low. And I assume I don't need to draw you a diagram to explain why that would be. When interest rates are low, borrowing costs are low, and obviously borrowing costs are the greater the longer you're going to be borrowing, the longer term your project is. So the higher order stage of production you're expanding, the longer term that it is, the more interest rate sensitive it is. So the more it's going to be stimulated by lower interest rates. So that's why we see the higher order stages being expanded, new plant and equipment, mining capacity being expanded, all these things, when interest rates are low, because it's a lot cheaper to do that. Whereas it's not that much cheaper to offer additional massages. Massages are in the realm of services, they're the lowest stage, but the higher you go in the stages of production, the more interest rate sensitive it is. So when interest rates come down, businesses are going to start investing more in the higher order stages. Now, how do interest rates come down? They come down because the public saves more. You and I save more. That pushes interest rates down because now the banks have more to lend, and so in effect, the price of lending is cheaper because loanable funds exist now in greater abundance. So now, why is it good for society that businesses should expand their long-term production processes and investment, capital goods? Why is it good that it should do that when interest rates are low? Why is that a good thing for society? It's a good thing for two basic reasons. Number one is, when you and I save more, when we don't rush out and blow every cent in our paychecks, what we are implicitly saying is that we're going to blow some part of our paychecks in the future. We're not going to consume it all now. We're going to spend some of our income in the future. Well, what is long-term production, after all, if not production for the future? So it's good that businesses are going to engage in long-term production oriented toward the future at a time when the general public has indicated it's going to spend more in the future. So there's a time coordination. But secondly, notice what happens on a practical level when you and I don't consume every cent in our paycheck. And we don't rush out and buy a new hat and a new magazine subscription, a new doorknob or whatever, is that these industries are going to contract a little bit. If we're not demanding as many hats, they're not going to produce as many hats. And therefore they're not going to need as many workers to produce hats. They're not going to need as many trucking services to ship the hats. They're not going to need as much steel for the hat production process. So in other words, consumer goods industries, the lower order stages, are going to contract somewhat when you and I save. Relatively speaking, they're going to contract. Where are these resources going to go? The trucking services that the hat makers aren't using, the workers that the hat makers aren't using. They're now going to be available for the higher order stages of production that businesses are now expanding. So you see, again, we have smooth coordination, thanks to the free market, that at a time when one sector of the economy relatively shrinks and thereby releases productive resources for use, well, these are now available to be used and to provide the material wherewithal for the very investment projects that businesses are now engaged in expanding. So again, interest rates perform this wonderful coordinating function in the economy. Now, let's suppose these coordinating functions are disrupted by some source. We won't identify what that source is right now. But let's say somebody somewhere interferes with this. And let's say that somebody decides, it would be really great to have lower interest rates, but I don't want to wait for people to save to bring them about. Let's have them right now. And so they bring them about, again, this unnamed institution brings about lower interest rates just by forcing them down. Exactly how they do this is another matter. They just force them down artificially. Well, here we've got some similarities and some differences with our previous example. Similarity is, in both cases, interest rates are low, and businesses are going to engage in expanding long-term production. But the differences are essential. Number one, in this case, there hasn't been any curtailing of consumption by the general public. So the general public is still going to consume as much or more as before. at a time when businesses are engaged in long-term product development. So people are demanding more of existing products, and businesses are engaged in long-term product development. So there's a time mismatch. But secondly, if we're not reducing our consumption, if these lower interest rates just came about arbitrarily, and they don't reflect the fact that we've curtailed consumption, then resources, productive factors, have not been released. Trucking services have not been released and made available for these new higher order stages of production to be invested in. So there aren't more workers, more trucks, more steel, more lumber. These things have not been released. So in other words, the economy now, instead of having coordination whereby we've got some constricting here and some expansion here, everything's trying to expand simultaneously. So the economy is on an unsustainable path that it can't finish. It lacks the physical stuff to finish all these things. We're not wealthy enough to do all this, to be doing all the consumption and all the higher order investment simultaneously. We don't have the stuff to do it. But we've been misled into thinking we do. Businesses have been misled into thinking we do. And so we are on an unsustainable path that ends in a bust. Now, of course, the institution I have in mind that, in fact, can push interest rates artificially low, lower than the free market wants to set them, is the central bank. In the American case, the Federal Reserve System. And when it does this, and it causes all this discoordination, this is all blamed on the free market. Well, gee, let's see. The Federal Reserve System was created by the Congress. It enjoys a government monopoly privilege on the creation of legal tender money out of thin air. But whatever it does is probably just the fault of the free market. I mean, that's the sort of thing that you get watching CNBC. I mean, this is what they want you to believe. It's just not to really ask any questions and just accept this sort of stuff. Now, what I like to give is this analogy some of you are probably tired of hearing of, but I don't care. I like this analogy. And that analogy is Mises' analogy from Chapter 20 of Human Action, and only because I've been rereading Human Action recently. I'm not like David Gordon, who memorizes every word of the book. I just happen to know it's Chapter 20. He's got in there an analogy, and he says, imagine the entire economy is like one guy, a master builder, who has the task before him. He's got a blueprint to build a house, but he only has 80% of the bricks that'll be necessary to build that house, and he doesn't know that. He thinks he has an adequate brick supply. So off he goes, building the house, building the house. Now, is it better for him to discover this error sooner or later? Obviously, the sooner he discovers this error, the better. He could say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I can't finish this particular house given the supply at my disposal. So I'll have to just cut out the gazebo, I'll cut out part of the third floor, I'll shrink the foundation, whatever. So if he discovers this after a couple of rows of bricks have been laid, well, too bad for him, but at least he hasn't wasted all his time and his resources. If he discovers his error as he's laying the final brick, this is a disaster. He's going to destroy the whole thing. It is unsustainable. And so what Mises is arguing is that this is like the whole economy. The whole economy is like this master builder that is trying to do things that can't be done, that we don't have the physical resources to do. And it's better for us to discover sooner than later our error. And now here's my elaboration of Austrian business cycle theory. This is my contribution to Austrian business cycle theory. It's my contribution to this analogy. And it's this. Would it help the master builder if we got him drunk so that he wouldn't really notice the dwindling brick supply? You know, he'd just be having a great old time. How would that help the situation? Would the house suddenly become buildable now? Obviously, this would do nothing to help him. It would simply postpone the problem, and that when the problem is discovered, it'll be all the worse because all this time he's been doing the wrong thing. Now you hear this and you think, well, of course we all understand this, right? Of course it wouldn't help to intoxicate this guy, but yet this is exactly what people are recommending when they say that when the economy turns down, what we need is the Federal Reserve System to make interest rates even lower. Low interest rates cause this problem, and let's make them even lower. Let's make them zero, baby. That's what they want. In fact, some people are saying zero is too stingy. We need interest rates to be like -5%. I'm not making this up. -5% is what we need. So in other words, more of what caused the problem should be the solution. So we have artificially low interest rates getting the economy on an unsustainable investment trajectory. let's continue, full steam ahead, continue to do the wrong thing. Continue to build unbuildable houses. Sure, wonderful. Now, this is not just some theoretical thing. We've actually lived through a textbook case of this very phenomenon. Because in 2001, we were just coming off a relatively mild recession associated with the NASDAQ bubble bursting. All these dot-com companies, these crazy companies that nobody knew what they did, or they didn't have any customers or profits or anything, and yet everybody thought we're going to get rich by investing in them. And that thing started to crash. Well, by 2001, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at that time, decided that he was sick and tired of the economy going down. It's time to laugh again, to quote Homer Simpson in the wake of the nuclear destruction in Springfield. It's time to laugh again. And so when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, all Alan Greenspan has, by and large, is the lower the interest rate hammer. So in 2001, he smashed that hammer 11 times. And so what happened as a result? Well, in 2001, the economy did not experience a terrible recession. It got out of the recession relatively quickly, and people said, wow, he's the maestro. He's infallible. In fact, the New York Times referred to Alan Greenspan as infallible. I mean, this is if that's not creeping you out, I mean, I assume nobody's reading the New York Times anymore, but just in case you miss it, that's the sort of thing you're missing. What in fact happened is, in 2001, we had the first recession ever in which housing starts didn't decline. So housing continues to go on. Because, again, money's being pumped into the economy like crazy. Interest rates are going to be kept super, super low. If you're walking down the street, you're barely conscious, people are throwing mortgage agreements at you. So people persist in this. Instead of having the economy clear itself out, do a sort of a Control-Alt-Delete and say, now wait a minute, because of earlier Fed intervention, we've been doing the wrong thing, we've been investing in the wrong things, we've got to start this whole thing over again. No, the economy was allowed to just continue doing as it had been doing before. The master builder was in effect being told, carry on, carry on. And so people came to the Fed-fueled conclusion that, wow, apparently even during a recession, housing prices are robust. Apparently they never go down. And you know what the best investment you can make is? It's housing. In fact, flipping houses is the best investment you can make. In fact, when you watch these infomercials at 3:30 in the morning, we have this barking dog next door to us. That's the reason I happen to know what's going on at 3:30 in the morning on television. But you'll see these crazy real estate commercials, about send your $40 and I'll send you my package of booklets that'll make you rich. But, those guys have nothing on the Federal Reserve System. Because people did make fortunes buying 5 houses with no money down. I mean, it sounds like something off at 3:30 in the morning, right? 5 houses, no money down, no job, no documentation. This is going to work out just super. I mean, this is what people were told. And so now when the bust comes, it's all the worse, because instead of clearing it out in 2001, we were all told to get drunk. And so we keep doing the wrong thing, so that when the bust comes, it's worse than it would have been had we done the right thing, and had there not been Federal Reserve intervention. Now, incidentally, Mises' example of the master builder also works to show unsustainable consumption. First, it shows unsustainable production. You're trying to produce things we don't have the stuff for. But it's also a good analogy for consumers who, during a Fed-fueled boom, and where it seems like everything's doing great, we're all up, and nobody can lose, and your house price in this most recent boom period, where we had a housing boom, well, people think housing prices just are never going to go down. Why should I bother saving? All the experts tell me I've got a perpetually appreciating asset. Only a sucker would save. No, no, no. Far from saving, I'm going out to Cold Stone Creamery and buying a $7 ice cream cone, baby. That makes sense. Yeah, then I'll wash it down with a $6 cup of coffee. Yeah, this is living, man. This is living. Well, if people had had a good sense of their real net worth, they wouldn't have been doing these things. They wouldn't have taken out these home equity loans to buy these exotic vacations and these fancy cars and buying more house than they should have bought in the first place. They wouldn't have done that if they could have seen things clearly, if interest rates had been allowed to tell the truth, if economic indicators had been allowed to tell the truth. Now, would we have had a housing bubble if there hadn't been a Federal Reserve System and a Soviet commissar in charge of money and interest rates, which is what I refer to the Federal Reserve Chairman as, because that basically is what he is. He's a central planner of money and interest rates. Well, the free market has a natural tendency to keep bubble phenomena in bounds. Because let's say there was no Fed, but just we all had this psychological mania whereby we all just wanted to buy a lot of houses. We just wanted to become house collectors. So we all just go out and start buying. Well, what would happen in that case? Well, first, house prices would shoot up. Check. We had that. But in this case, the banks would actually run out of money to lend us. Because in this case, there wouldn't be a Soviet commissar who can just pump more money in. They'd actually have to say, well, wait a minute, we don't have any more to lend. So interest rates would shoot up, and that would put an end to speculation in real estate. But if you've got an Alan Greenspan who can just keep the spigot going, you can just keep this fantasy world going. Secondly, on this Fed point and housing, we hear a lot about lending standards declining. And that is true, right? We all know lending standards were very low during this recent boom. And that's partly because of legislation and various pressures that federal and quasi-federal agencies were putting on banks. But we can't let the Fed off the hook here either. Because think of it this way, let's suppose we've got a basketball team. And we pick the players for our team, and then as soon as we pick them, we get told that, by the way, you're allowed to pick 2 more players. Where am I going to pick those 2 more players from? From the pool of people I rejected 5 minutes ago. So the very fact that I can pick more players means my standards have to decline. Well, likewise, the banks suddenly find themselves flush with cash. They're comfortably within this Federal Reserve cartel system, so it's in their interest to lend that all out up to the legal maximum. And so they're going to start saying, hey, remember Ethel we rejected a few weeks ago? Let's get her back in here and see how she feels about a adjustable rate mortgage. So this is a natural tendency of what happens when you increase the money supply. Now, in the midst of all this, we had something called the Greenspan put, which you can Wikipedia that. The Greenspan put refers to this phenomenon by which investors more or less understood that Alan Greenspan would come to the rescue if asset prices should fall below a certain level. He's going to come to the rescue. And there are examples of this sort of thing going on. In 1998, a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, there's an Orwellian name for you, Long-Term Capital Management. We've got like $120 billion and we've lent it up 10 times, whatever. I mean, it was some absurd, as actually the figures were far, far more absurd than that. But Long-Term Capital Management gets into big trouble in 1998. And so Greenspan arranges for a bailout of long-term capital management. Now, what conclusion do you suppose investment banks draw from this? Well, naturally, the conclusion they draw is if Greenspan is going to make sure that some crummy hedge fund doesn't go under, there's no way an investment bank is going to go under. Forget it. So instead of getting their houses in order and saying, now wait a minute, we can't act like crazy lunatics anymore, they say, full steam ahead. Our friend at the central bank is going to help us out. Look at Lehman Brothers as an example. Now, Lehman Brothers was, of course, not bailed out. But in the weeks following the collapse of Bear Stearns, Lehman is able to attract hundreds of millions of dollars. A major money market fund, where it's supposed to be putting money in the safest investments, is giving huge sums to freaking Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers has the same kind of assets that Bear Stearns has. Why are they able to attract all this type of money in the wake of the complete collapse of an identical firm? Well, because, as we've since learned, the expectation was that there was a pretty good chance that probably the government would bail it out. Now, in this case, the government didn't bail it out. But the point is, you see this type of behavior, and it is the very existence of the Federal Reserve that makes this kind of crazy thinking possible. Because everybody knows there is no physical constraint on how much money can be created to bail out a favored firm or a favored constituency. There's no physical constraint on it. The only constraint is a constraint of political will, which is not a very strong constraint, as we've seen. So the very existence of the Fed institutionalizes the problem of moral hazard, whereby people act with an artificially elevated level of risk tolerance because they figure some suckers will bear all the losses. And yet Alan Greenspan had the nerve earlier this year to go before Congress and innocently observe that, well, you know, it turns out there's a flaw in the free market that I just hadn't noticed before. Well, you know what, Alan? We found that flaw. It's you. You're the flaw. That's the problem. Now, all right, that was sort of recognized, right? That was sort of now, people will say, didn't we have crises before there was a Federal Reserve System? I mean, you're not going to try to blame the Panic of 1819 on Alan Greenspan. Well, I might. No, actually, no. But if you look at, now this is a topic that I won't have that much time to discuss tonight, but just so you won't think I'm evading it, although why would I bring it up if I was just going to evade it? First of all, there was some discussion of this in Meltdown, my book that Scott mentioned. There's a YouTube I did on this subject called Monetary Lessons from America's Past. That's linked from my website, tomwoods.com. So that's there. But I'll just say a few things about it. If you look in the 19th century, you find all kinds of bank bailouts going on, where the banks get special privileges, where they don't have to make good on their promises, monopoly privileges, artificial credit creation, government-privileged national banks. They're all over the place. Richard Timberlake is not an Austrian economist, but he is an excellent historian of monetary institutions. And Timberlake said that the 19th century panics were all caused by one form or another of government money manipulation or intrusion into money, not by something called the gold standard. 1819 and 1837, you can just look at what the national banks that existed at that time did, inflating the money supply and bringing about those particular downturns. But let's just say a brief thing about the 1870s, because we've been told the 1870s is the period of the long depression. There's a depression from 1873 to 1879. It was just terrible. Well, interestingly, economic historians, professionals, no longer believe there was a long depression. What they believe now, and this is even the New York Times admitted this a couple of years ago. The New York Times admits nothing. So even they admitted this. That what in fact happened was a modest recession in 1873, and then decent growth by most of the metrics that you would consult to look at economic health. The 1870s and 1880s were a tremendously prosperous period in American history. The reason people falsely believed later that there had been this terrible depression seems to be that the price level fell so consistently by about 3.8% on average per year. But the price level falling does not correspond with bad economic times. There is no such correlation in economic history. But beyond even this, if you look at the various economic panics, financial panics in American history, before the Fed and after the Civil War, so 1873, 1884, a couple in the 1890s and 1907, if you look at these, it is true that after the Fed was created, there were fewer of these. They did deal partly with the panic problem, and not simply by just not calling things panics anymore, although that was one way that they dealt with it. They just don't call anything a panic anymore, and then no more of them. But it wasn't just that. It's that one of the reasons for these financial panics involved the seasonality of liquidity demands. Because of cotton production, various other types of production, there would be heavy liquidity demands in some parts of the year, not so heavy in other parts. And the American banking system had trouble coping with this because of a regulation that existed called unit banking, which I've only talked about this a couple times. But unit banking means that every bank is allowed to have just one office. You can't have a branch in another state. You can't have a branch in another county. You can't have a branch. Now, what do you think that does to the stability of the banking system? Well, obviously you have an extremely undiversified banking system. Because every bank, sort of making loans in this sort of 3-inch area, and they can't diversify their portfolios by expanding throughout the country. And so one of the results is these panics. Now, if you look at Canada at the same time, 1873, 1884, they're not experiencing any of this. They're not having any of these panics. And is that because Canada has a wonderful central bank that's seeing them through? Canada didn't get a central bank, the Bank of Canada, until 1935. Here's what Canada did not have. They did not have unit banking. And so they didn't have these panics. So yes, the Fed did help solve a problem, but it was a non-existent problem in other countries because they didn't have these idiotic regulations. So notice, these regulations that existed made the banking system less stable. So in this case, less regulation, more stability. Secondly, by the way, let me also point out, central banking, although it can help deal with a non-problem, as we've seen, it does not actually improve the situation in terms of bank crises. And this is a point that Charles Calamiris from Columbia Business School makes. If you look at the number of banking crises we had in the period from about 1874 to 1913, if you look at that period, and we define a banking crisis as a large number of cluster of bank failures that are accompanied by major losses. If you look at that period, there are probably four banking crises. There's 1890 in Argentina, 1893 in Australia, 1893 also in Italy, and 1900 in Norway. Four. Now, since 1978, roughly the 30-year period since then, how many banking crises in this wonderful age of central banking where all this goes away, right? All our problems are solved, and you'd have to be some crank to want to go back to not having a central bank. How many banking crises have we had? 140. If we define it as a major cluster of bank failures associated with major losses. And 20 of those 140 were worse than the two worst of the four I mentioned in the 1874 to 1913 period, the Argentina and Australia. So we've had bank failures where the losses are like 20% of GDP. So the idea that this is all crazy stuff, that the experts have dealt with all this, we've got the best conceivable system. Come on, come on. Let's try to consider something that CNBC won't talk about. We don't have to get all our information from Newsweek. Maybe there are other people and other perspectives that need to be consulted. Now, what about regulation, right? If we had enough regulation, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't have had these problems if we'd had enough regulation, right? I know you've probably never heard anyone bring up that argument, right? No one's ever raised that with you, but I've heard it a couple times. So I have a bunch of responses to that. The first is the regulators told us everything was fine, right? The existing regulators, they didn't see anything wrong. Securitization's working fine. Lending standards are fine. Ben Bernanke himself told us lending standards are better than ever. I mean, he's in charge of regulating the banks. He's the head of the Fed. So they all said everything was fine. So I guess the idea is if we have more of them, then maybe there'll be enough of a small minority that can outvote the big bunch of people. So in other words, we're going to rely on people to tell the government and the Fed the opposite of what it wants to hear. And that's going to keep our system stable. Let's also remember, how many people do you know who went to business school saying, I want to grow up to be a federal regulator? No one, right? No one says that. So in other words, the bright kids do not become the regulators. The bright kids become the entrepreneurs who run circles around the regulators. So if there's something systemically wrong, you can regulate this thing all you want, and they'll always be 3 steps ahead of you. If you have a gigantic money creation system that gives you this business cycle problem, that gives you this moral hazard problem, you can regulate this thing all you want. But you're not getting to the root of the problem. Because we hear a lot about, gosh, these firms were leveraged up. They had borrowed so much. They were buying a lot of these assets with borrowed money. And they were so leveraged up. Why did we never ask the question, why were they so leveraged up? Like, why are they leveraged up and shoe companies aren't so leveraged up, and hat companies or car companies? Why is it that most businesses, if you look at equity ratios, 50 to 60%, and the financial industry, it's like 2%? Why would that be? Again, it's because they rely on the central bank to help them with their liquidity problems. Even the International Monetary Fund admitted this in a report in April 2008. They said, it seems like these firms are expecting that their friends at the central bank are going to help them out. Oh, gee, you don't say. Really? You think that's their expectation? I want to know where they got that idea from. Then we have the ratings agencies. This will be a whole separate night. That's a whole separate night. But I would, again, recommend Calamiris and Larry White. Lawrence H. White has a good article on the ratings agencies. I'm going to skip the S&Ls because just in the interest of time. But let me go into the specifics, though, quickly about the regulation. Because supposedly we had this big wave of deregulation, right? And then it led directly to the crisis. Now again, Professor Calamiris of Columbia Business School has been having a lot of fun in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere debunking this claim. Because if you look at the so-called deregulation, let's look at it. It's basically 3 things. The first thing is getting rid of so-called Regulation Q. Regulation Q had previously imposed limits on the height of interest rates that banks could pay on savings deposits. So they got rid of that. Okay? I don't think that led to the meltdown of the global financial system, so that's the first one. The second one is eliminating remaining restrictions on branch banking. So we've already seen the problems caused by limiting branching in the 19th century. Well, the final straw of this, getting rid of the last of these restrictions so that you could actually have nationwide banking, that was gotten rid of in 1994. Well, again, this obviously stabilizes the system. This is obviously better. It makes the system more stable than otherwise. And then thirdly, the removal of restrictions on banks on underwriting corporate securities, debt and equity. Now, this is supposed to be an incredibly risky thing. Really? Underwriting securities? Underwriting corporate securities? It's a very short-term, time-limit thing. You're just creating a market for these securities. It is, if only the banks had been doing more of that instead of securitizing terrible mortgages. Like, this is not a... Who cares, right? This is not a big deal. So none of this all has zero to do with the additional risks that were taken on during this period. Every single thing that the banks did, including the investment banks, during these past 10 or so years, could have been done without any of this deregulation. All of it. And in fact, this deregulation doesn't even apply to investment banks, doesn't even apply to them. So if people are going to say, well, we had deregulation and then we had the crisis, therefore one caused the other. Sorry, you're going to need to have a little more evidence than that. It's not really persuasive. So what are we supposed to do when we get the collapse? Well, we're told, how about fiscal stimulus, right? Let's blow some money. That ought to do it, right? Let's just borrow a lot of money, and then we'll just blow it on arbitrary things. And if you're going to make a fuss about what we're blowing it on, it just shows how little economics you understand. You see, it is the blowing of the money that matters. It's not the recipient. We've got to just spend it. So we've been told, 800 billion? Sure, let's just spend it. Well, let's think now about why this is not a sensible thing to do. And I realize, this is shooting fish in a barrel. Why, in a crisis, should you not borrow and print an additional 800 billion and blow it? But I am going to explain it. First of all, what are the problems with the economy according to the Austrian theory that we've looked at in the wake of an artificial boom? Well, first of all, let's understand the artificial boom is the problem. Okay? The bust is the solution. Now, that can be taken out of context very easily. I understand that, right? That, I'm callous. I don't care about people who are unemployed. That's not true. What my point is simply this, that when that master builder was building an unbuildable house, sure, he was working, right? I mean, that would look like, hey, that's prosperity. He's working. He's probably employing people. Isn't that wonderful? But if he's building something that has no point to it, and that has to be stopped and is wasting resources and making society poorer, why would that be good? The recession, as that analogy teaches us, is the good thing. That's when the economy catches up to this trickery and says, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this stuff. We should stop doing this and start doing that. Entrepreneurs need to move factors of production out of some areas into other areas. That's what needs to be done. Okay, so that's the problem. So the problem is not, by the way, that consumer spending has fallen, and so we need to stimulate consumer spending. That is not the problem. The problem is we've stimulated housing as just one example. The whole stock market collapsed too. It wasn't just housing. We've stimulated all this higher order production at a time when consumers aren't saving enough to sustain it. So we've got this unsustainable path going on. If we stimulate more consumption, we just make it worse, because now all this production, all this long-term investment that's been started, as it is, the profitability is collapsing there. And if you stimulate more consumption, so consumers go out and spend on the lower order stages, and they pull more resources back for use in the lower order stages, pull more resources away from the higher, you're just making the collapsing profitability up there even worse. So that is the exact opposite thing that you want to do. But so what we've got in the economy, therefore, are imbalances. Artificially low interest rates cause too much of some things to be produced, too little of other things. And what often will happen when a boom really gets going is a lot of crazy things that in normal conditions wouldn't have even been at the table to bid for credit, get to sit at the same table for credit as everybody else. So you get too much of this, too little of that. Too much expansion up here, too little down here. There are imbalances. How are those imbalances fixed? By borrowing $800 billion and just blowing the money arbitrarily. It has nothing to do, it's not even relevant to the question. So it is instead, my analogy with fiscal stimulus is that it is like drinking Red Bull instead of sleeping. That's really what it is. Because what you're doing is, it's like when you have Red Bull, which I've never consumed, by the way, but when you drink Red Bull, you probably think, hey, now I won't crash, because I drank some Red Bull. Now, I haven't consumed any Red Bull myself, but my feeling is you probably do crash eventually. I mean, like, it doesn't keep you up forever. What it does is it finds whatever part of your body is not totally exhausted, and then it goes and exhausts that. Well, that's what this stuff does, right? Whatever part of the economy hasn't had its profitability totally collapse, well, that's what we're going to strain. We're going to pull those resources into arbitrary ones from the government. Now, let me consider, though, the sophisticated reply to fiscal stimulus is juvenile and doesn't work. The sort of semi-sophisticated Keynesian reply would be to say that, Woods, you're all wrong here, because in the case of a major downturn, we have idle resources. So one of the points I'm making is, if we just take resources from here and just spend them over here on a bridge building project or whatever, all we're doing is just, we're just taking jobs away from here and putting them over here. Like, we're not on net creating anything. If anything, we're making things worse because government puts money toward arbitrary projects because it has no profit and loss feedback mechanism. But people will say, no. That's not the case because we have idle resources. So the resources we're going to use for the bridge building project, let's say, aren't even being used, right? They're unemployed. No one's using them. So they don't have any alternative uses. So you're just being a miser, not letting us go and put them to good use. Well, I'm not a miser, number one. Number two, the reason I'm not a miser is for this. I mean, think of that bridge building project. I use that arbitrarily. It could be anything, okay? It could be building a barn. I don't know. Could be building a mechanical dragon. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I got that from Anthony Gregory, by the way, because he calculated that if we took the Pentagon budget from all these Cold War years and we had blown it on one big, giant R&D project, he felt like we probably could have built a dragon. And that was the opportunity cost of the Cold War. We don't have a dragon. We could have had it. And anyway, the bridge building project I'm using just arbitrarily. What types of things do you need to build a bridge? I mean, you need steel, you need precision screws, you need bolts, you need bridge builders. So are you telling me that we have unemployed in our economy at this moment the resources and workers in the precise proportions necessary to build that bridge project? Well, I don't think we do. I think, to the contrary, to get the workers and all the resources you need, you will have to bid them away from existing projects where consumers have indicated they want them. Hey, what are we going to do? We're going to take people unemployed from Merrill Lynch and get them to build a bridge? They've sold us enough bridges, heaven knows, right? But so in other words, you are inevitably going to be drawing from existing projects. There is no way to get around this. But secondly, again, we never get the why. We never get the why. We get the, we're in a crisis. Now let's, do some crazy things. We never get the, why are we in the damn crisis? We never get that. Okay, well, likewise, why are the resources idle? That's the unaskable question. That's the question they'll turn off your microphone for. Okay, why do we have so many idle resources? And what would be the source of an error this massive? That workers are idle, major, like we've got plant that's idle, huge capital goods, sectors of the capital goods market, they're all idle. Why are they all idle? Why are these resources idle? What could possibly have caused such massive systemic miscalculation that we would have produced all these things that there's no use for? Gee, could it have something to do with the Austrian business cycle? Could it have something to do with interfering with the major signals that entrepreneurs get to decide what they should invest in? Could it have something to do with interfering with the structure of interest rates, pushing them lower than the market wants to set them? The example I like to give, which I borrow sort of from Peter Schiff, but I use it for a different purpose, is imagine you've got a restaurant owner in Vancouver, and because that's where the Olympics are in February. And the Olympics come to town. He doesn't know the Olympics are in town. He just thinks people really like his food. So people are coming in. Everybody's wearing the Olympic rings on their shirt, and it's just not getting through the guy's thick skull. He just thinks, man, I'm on top of the world, baby. Everybody likes my corn dog or whatever. Everybody likes my pizza. So he builds another restaurant. Now he's got 2 of them. And, you know, for a while, they're doing okay. Then the Olympics go away. Now he's got like a whole restaurant worth of nothing, of idle resources, right? Idle resources. He's got waiters and waitresses standing around going, this stinks, right? He's got tables no one's sitting at. So he's got idle resources. So do we want to stimulate these idle resources back into activity by giving him government funding? No. The idle resources are the problem. They need to be reallocated, and the government does not know how best to reallocate them other than what's going to get more votes for me in the next congressional election. They don't know where these things should go. How would they? How could they non-arbitrarily deploy those resources? Now, I've been sort of fond of mentioning the Depression of 1920 to 21. And I'm fond of mentioning it because it gets so little attention. Now it's getting some attention. But until this year, there wasn't even a Wikipedia entry for the Depression of 1920. Not even an entry on Wikipedia, right? How can this be? I mean, like, I bet you Mark Craney, who was Jethro Tull's drummer for one album, I bet you he has a Wikipedia page, right? Okay? And he was a drummer in like 1980, okay? On the A album that fans sort of debate whether they like or not. I think I'm getting a little bit off topic here. Point is, if he's got a Wikipedia entry, why is there no Wikipedia entry on the Great Depression of 1920? Well, there is one now. Okay? And by the way, I didn't write it. I don't even know how to. I'm very low tech. I can send email, I can do Facebook, but I have no idea how to do anything on Wikipedia. Well, in that depression, I just wrote an article on this in the Intercollegiate Review, and again, you can find it on my articles page, tomwoods.com. It's called Warren Harding and the Forgotten Depression of 1920. And I have a YouTube on this called Why You've Never Heard of the Great Depression of 1920. And it's gotten like 50,000 views. Like, I can't believe how dorky the American population is. I didn't realize it was quite that dorky. That's wonderful. So people are watching this thing. Well, in that depression, okay, so what happened in that depression? We got double-digit unemployment very suddenly, double-digit drops in production, just catastrophic. So what happened? Did we have fiscal stimulus? Did we have monetary stimulus? No. In fact, the federal budget was cut in half in the first 2 years, 1920 to 1922, and the Federal Reserve System did not do anything to turn the money supply around. And I quote people as all acknowledging this. The top, or not just the top, all marginal income tax rates were reduced, and the national debt was cut by 1/3. And by late summer of 1921, there are already indications that the thing is turning around. So they did exactly the opposite of what we're told needs to be done. They should have experienced a deflationary spiral down to the center of the earth, and they didn't. And so maybe you can decide, I leave as an exercise for the student, why this particular episode is not really highlighted typically. Well, I decided that I would go for about 1 hour. I started at 6. I got about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to just stop with a couple points. First, let's start listening to people with a clue. Now, people in this room are probably listening to people with a clue. But send those YouTubes to your friends. But not all the time, because then they stop opening your emails. Okay? You got to be discriminating in the good sense of the word, right? You got to find the best, send them out there. Okay? So send out Peter Schiff things, because he's funny. He's funny. Jim Grant is not as funny, but in his writing he's kind of funny. Jim Rogers can be hilarious. I saw Jim Rogers on CNBC telling the host of the program he was on that this person maybe needed to go into another line of work because I don't think you know how to read a balance sheet. He's fun. He's fun to watch because this was a person saying Fannie and Freddie were in great shape. This is like 2 weeks after the catastrophe came. Jim Rogers is wondering, what am I on Mars? Like, how could I be on a financial network and you're not getting this? And then Ron Paul, who is the most patient person of all. Like, you know, I mean, he could say, I've been teaching you morons this for about 30 years and nobody's freaking listening. He could, but he doesn't say that. He doesn't. In fact, he gives everyone else credit for all the things that he does. Those are the people that, if we had a normal society, would be highlighted and welcomed and we'd all be talking about. Instead, our society wants to hear from Ben Bernanke, who is, I mean, you have to admit, he is batting 1,000, right? He's been wrong on everything. Every single thing since he's become chairman, he's been wrong. I mean, it's bizarre to think of all the things that he's been wrong about. Or Hank Paulson. Boy, there's a guy with some insight we need to listen to. Or Larry Summers. Let's get him over here for a speech. Or Greenspan. Alan, hey, everybody, take out an adjustable rate mortgage. Greenspan. Let's all listen to that guy. But also the economics profession at large. Now, again, there are honorable exceptions. I'm not going to say that only the Austrians make any sense. That's not. There are some decent non-Austrian economists out there. However, by and large, the profession is in a shambles. The American Economic Review is not being read by anyone. And I can prove that on the basis of a study they did, where they did a survey trying to figure out how many people read the average article in the American Economic Review. And the answer is 2.5 people. So if you leave out the editor and the author, we're down to like a half a guy reading this thing. It's all mathematics, it's all jargon. What was once a weird sort of cultish corner of the profession is now the profession, where everything has to mimic physics and be incomprehensible and be methodologically illegitimate and so on. But secondly, another point I want to point out, Joseph Stiglitz, you know him, a Nobel Prize winner, he's at Columbia. Stiglitz wrote an article some years ago, co-authored an article, that he was paid to author by Fannie Mae. And in this paper, you will be shocked to learn, Stiglitz alleges that nothing Fannie Mae is doing will ever, the chances are essentially zero that it will ever cost the taxpayer a cent. Now, as I say, he was paid to write this article. Well, when Professor Calamiris, whom I've mentioned a couple times from Columbia, cited this article, pointed this out on the internet, it suddenly disappeared from Fannie Mae's website. It's gone. Now, if you search around, we all know, once something's on the internet, it's hard to make it really go away. You can dig that baby up, and people have. So you can look for Stiglitz and Fannie Mae. There's your economics profession. Now, I am not saying we tar everyone with that sort of brush, but for goodness sake here, people are still going to this guy, and you know, again, how about people who had some idea what they're talking about? Well, then we would perhaps have change we can believe in. Now, we here right now, we have to endure living under a system, a two-party system, that is, as my friend Butler Schaefer puts it, really two wings of the same bird of prey. So, you know, you vote for change, you vote for anti-war, you vote for civil liberties, and you get war, more surveillance, and Wall Street bailouts. So regardless, apparently no matter what you do, this is what you're going to get. So they steal from you and they call it taxation. They threaten to kidnap you and call it military conscription and patriotism. And they starve 500,000 kids and call it foreign policy. These are the people we live under. Now, normally, if I give a talk on the economy, I wouldn't say things like this that are a little more provocative because, you know, we want to stay professional and so on, but sometimes I just get ticked off and I just can't stop things I might want to say, and I have Scott Horton in the room and I have to live up to that expectation. But so after they've looted us and lied to us and exploited us, then they throw us a few crumbs. Oh, here, we'll give you some health care. You know what? Give me back all the money that you took from me and all the inflation that you've done to my wealth, that you've taken away to fund this empire and these bailouts and all these other things you've done. Just give me all that back, and I'm pretty sure my neighbors and I and my local physician can figure something out. Okay, I don't need to be part of your crummy regime. So it seems like we as Americans, and especially people here in a college town, we need to have enough respect, self-respect, enough dignity as human beings to spit in their faces and to withdraw morally and spiritually from this regime. Now, you can be a drone who repeats the talking points of an Obama or a McCain. Or you can be a thinking person, a moral person, a fighting person, who says you're all a bunch of liars and crooks and killers, and I'm too intelligent to be sucked into the phony choices you're giving me. I would rather choose freedom. Well, folks, I hope you will find out about the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and as I said, I've got information out here about it. I hope you'll check me out at tomwoods.com, and I say that even pointing out to you, by the way, you cannot send me money through this website, so it's not some cheap way for me to try to get money. You cannot, there's no address, there's nothing. There's a contact link, but there's no PayPal. But I've put a lot of articles there that you might find useful, and audio and video that's useful. But above all tonight, I hope you'll find out about Young Americans for Liberty. Because I couldn't be a stronger supporter of this organization. They sponsored this event with help from Midas Resources. If you don't want to be some stooge, if you want to resist the parasites who spend their time telling us how indispensable they are and how lost we'd all be without them, if you want to stand for something, peace, truth, freedom, and prosperity, then please, please join us, and our cause can win. Thank you very much.